welcome on in to the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider from KSL Sports. Good to be back with you guys on a Wednesday, a little bit different. Not doing the live stream today. Gonna figure out when exactly to do that. It might be Monday, but back with you on a Wednesday. And on today's episode, I'm gonna be diving into the fall camp position battles. So what's going on at these spots, and who's stepping up, who's fighting for a spot, and who might just emerge as an X factor for Utah. So be breaking down the biggest position battles. Obviously, we all know what those are: cornerback, defensive end, sorting out the running back and wide receiver rooms, and then obviously the ever important backup quarterback spot. So grab some headphones, grab a coffee, grab an energy drink. This is going to be an action-packed 30 minute episode. So let's get to it. To start, let's get into the defensive secondary for Utah. Utah's cornerback battle, pretty interesting, right? So Utah has a couple guys that they're bringing back from last year's team that have a lot of experience, gained a lot of valuable experience last year, and are being counted on as the guys to lead this team. And that's Smith Snowden, that's Scooby Davis. And we've heard a lot from Smith Snowden this offseason, having the opportunity to talk with him at Big 12 Media Days, and obviously, everything going on this offseason there with Snowden and the interest in him. Utah bringing him back this year is significant for the program. And with Scooby, we've heard a lot of good things about his development, and how, Coach Shaw talked about how the experience he gained last year was transformative for him, or maybe that was Smith Snowden. But, getting the opportunity to talk with him yesterday after Tuesday's practice and seeing him, without his pads on, and seeing the physical development, but more so seeing just how much more confident he actually was, it was really interesting. And so I think he's going to be, a very important part of this defense. Speaking of Scoob and what he's going to mean to this defense, it was really clear. I had the opportunity to talk with him last year, and just the comparison between Scooby 2024 and Scooby 2025 is just it's really impressive. Just how different, he sounds more confident and more sure of himself. And I think that's going to bode well for him as he gets into year 2, starting at cornerback for Utah. With that, there is that open spot opposite of Scooby, and that's been one of the more interesting position battles in fall camp. It's been one of the more hotly followed and discussed battles of camp. It was interesting going back, I think it was either last week or the week before, Whittingham acknowledged that, this expanded to 3 or 4 guys with the way that Jeremiah Caldwell and JC Hart were playing. It seemed like those two had closed the gap on Blake Cotton and Donovan Saunders, who were viewed as the favorites to emerge from that competition. But as of Monday, talking to Kyle Whittingham, he shared that Blake Cotton has established himself as the guy at that open spot. So I think it's really interesting that Utah's, that they feel, as good as they do with Cotton, for Whittingham to go out and just declare that, like he did. I think it speaks to what Cotton has done over the last week or so, and given, Saturday's scrimmage coming last week, and Whittingham's comments coming on the heels of that, I think that's pretty telling in terms of how Cotton probably performs. And getting to hear from Cotton on Tuesday, we've talked to him before. We talked to him during spring ball, but getting the opportunity to hear from him yesterday was really interesting and enlightening. I came away really impressed with his mentality and how he approaches the position, it was pretty evident that, he's a guy that's experienced a lot of football, good and bad. And that has sort of molded his attitude and mindset at this spot. And so, with him, I thought this quote was really noteworthy, and when asked about sort of his approach to how he plays, he said the mentality you have to have as a defensive back when stuff goes wrong, you just got to keep going. It's that dog mentality. And all the man coverage we play, we're going to be on an island most of the time. So we got to buckle down and fight. And I thought, like, he said that, and that hit home for me, that that's the sort of mentality you want in a Utah cornerback, given, the scheme, given the identity that Morgan Scalley wants, and the brand and culture that Utah has built with the physicality and toughness. That's the sort of mindset that you want in a cornerback. And they love corners that are willing to come up and play physical. And, Scooby Davis mentioned, that being a thing that Cotton brings to the table is, he's a physical presence. He's a confident player. And I think that's what you want in, your cornerback at Utah. You want that toughness. You want the fight, the mental toughness more so than anything. So, with Donovan Saunders, this is still this is going to be interesting because, when he committed to Utah this time around, I viewed him as the favorite to, earn this spot, given the fact that, when Utah initially recruited him, when he transferred from Cal Poly, he was a top target for them. They ended up with Kenan Johnson and Cam Calhoun, but I thought Donovan Saunders coming here, from Texas A&M, that's where he transferred originally, from Cal Poly, committed to A&M over Utah. But, him coming back to Utah after a year in College Station, I thought that he would be the guy to emerge. And so, for Donovan, I think this is important to continue to compete and continue to fight, because this was a really close competition, according to everybody that's commented on it, that's talked about it. This has been a really tight competition. And with what we've seen over the years under Morgan Scalley, they like to play three outside cornerbacks. They like to have a little bit of a rotation and a little bit of, some different body types to throw in the mix. I've talked about it before, but going back to 2019, it was Jalen Johnson. It was Tariq Lewis and Josh Nurse. It was Jav Guidry on the inside. It was those four cornerbacks, and we've seen that even recently with others, Clark Phillips, Amaya Vaughn, and JT Broughton, that being a sort of outside rotation as well. So, I think it's going to be important for Saunders to continue to compete and continue to, play at a good level, because I firmly believe we're going to see all three. And I think it's even important. It's even more important, at this spot in particular, for Jeremiah Caldwell and J.C. Hart to continue to work on their game, because as we remember last year, right, it wasn't supposed to be Scooby Davis. It wasn't supposed to be Cam Calhoun. It was supposed to be Kenan Johnson. So Utah had to dive into their depth at cornerback, given the injury to Johnson. So I think it's going to be important that Saunders, that Caldwell and Hart continue to work on their craft and continue to keep pace with Cotton and Scooby, as it seems like those guys are now setting the pace at that cornerback room. So that'll be interesting to see how the rest of that room shakes out and what we hear over the next week or so. But I feel good about this spot with Cotton emerging and taking hold of this spot. I think, given the fact that he's coming from UC Davis with 3 years of experience, the fact that he's 6'2", 190 pounds, is willing to play physical ball, is willing to, just continue to fight and bring that sort of mental toughness, I think is really good for that position group. So, I think this is going to be, an interesting one. And, as we've heard over the course of the last 2 weeks, there are going to be others that sort of influence how this secondary shakes out. And a guy like Jackson Benny, who's put himself in position to earn some reps. So we'll be interested to see how this is finalized and what the depth chart looks like. But I feel pretty optimistic that we're going to see Scooby and Cotton starting on the outside with Saunders and Caldwell backing those two up. So let's transition to perhaps the next biggest battle on the defensive side of the ball, and that's that defensive end spot. And with this group, I'm really interested to see who emerges. Opposite of Logan Fano. I think we're all sort of looking at this competition as who's going to be the best pass rusher. But with Fano locked in at one spot, and it seems like he's the best hope for Utah to emerge as a premier pass rusher. He's had a great offseason, speaking of Fano, and I genuinely believe that he's primed and ready to go and essentially be unlocked as Utah's de facto pass rusher, like we've seen in years past with Bradley Anai and Mika Tafua. I think Fano is gearing up and is going to be ready for that type of role. I'm excited to see what Fano does, but Utah needs somebody to take hold of that defensive end spot opposite of him. And so this is, an open starting competition. And I think as camp has progressed and the more we've heard from coaches, I think there have been three names that have been talked about pretty consistently. That's John Henry Daly, Lance Holsclaw, and Cash Dillon. And it seems to be a pretty tight race. And, with these three, obviously when you're talking about defensive end, the first thing you're going to think about is, how are they as pass rushers? Speed, technique, and just how they perform in general are important things. But when we're talking about defensive ends at Utah, the the job number one, regardless of position, really, is still stopping the run. And so, that's going to be a big priority, especially with Fano on the other side. Not that Fano is a bad run defender. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm just saying, what we've seen in the past where Utah's had a designated pass rusher like Amika Tafu and Bradley Anai is, it's been the job of the other defensive end to play more sound and more geared towards the run game and being more of a complement. So I think that's something to keep in mind here with this open defensive end spot. And even beyond just the starting job, I think gaining clarity in terms of what the rotation is going to look like, because I think it's important for Utah to keep, a pretty consistent and a pretty healthy rotation of defensive ends. You've got a number of them. You've got guys that bring, good athleticism, good size to the position. And I think it's going to be really important for Utah to figure out what their rotation is going to look like. So getting back to that open starting job specifically, I believe, Cash Dillon has had a great offseason based on everything that I've learned about him, going back to spring ball and conversations in the winter and how winter workouts went. I feel like Cash Dillon has worked extremely hard to put himself in position to essentially emerge this season. I think, he's going to be a guy that, emerges this year for Utah as a guy in this defensive end rotation at the very least. I would not be surprised, one bit to see him take hold of the starting job if he doesn't earn it coming out of camp. I think he's the guy, if we're talking long-term best bets, which we don't bet on this on this podcast or in this state, we don't do that. But if we had to, Cash Dillon is who I would bet on, and I think he just has the sort of work ethic and mentality that again just sort of bodes well for guys at Utah. He just works hard on his craft, works hard in the weight room, works hard in the film room, all of those sort of things. And not to say that, the other guys don't, but he got a lot of people raved about the work that he put in this offseason. So I like Cash Dillon to emerge at some point, but with that, I think it's Lance Holzclaw is going to be a factor as well with this spot. I think Holzclaw. I've heard that he's put on a good amount of weight, where he's up closer to 240. He may even be over 240 pounds. And coming to Utah, he was sort of viewed. I sort of viewed him, anyways, as a designated pass rusher, a Pita T type, right? Coming here from Washington, and the initial word, when people got a look at him in spring ball was, that get off, that burst at the snap is special. He's got that sort of juice that you like to see, that bodes well for a designated pass rusher type of role. But the fact that he's come into fall camp with those additional pounds on him, I think is encouraging for what it could mean for him overall, and what sort of role he could take, where he could play potentially more than just that specialized type of role. But regardless, I think Holzclaw is going to be a pretty significant factor in this defensive end rotation. And two, I think John Henry Daly, with the spring that he had, he's continued to carry that momentum into fall camp. And I think Paul Fitzgerald, is probably going to serve as a primary backup to Logan Fano. But I think when we're talking about that spot opposite of Fano, I think it's going to be a mixture of those three guys. And like I said, where I'd put my money, it would be Cash Dillon, right? It makes sense. You put your money on cash, right? We like cash money. That's what we like. We like cash money. And so that's where I'm leaning, in that open defensive end spot. Now, as for, this next spot, I think the running back room is really fascinating. So obviously Utah working in an entirely new cast of characters at running back with Mark Atuaya, bringing in Wayshawn Parker, bringing in Kerry Rogers, Devin Green, Daniel Bray, Racing Guillory, and Bryce Duke. That's a whole new set of faces and names to get used to. And so, with this, it does look like it's pretty clear that Wayshawn Parker and Kerry Rogers have established themselves as, the top two in this room. And, with Wayshawn, he's coming in with high expectations, given what he was able to produce last year at Washington State, which we all know what Washington State is. And the fact he was able to get to 730 yards and 4 touchdowns on 135 carries, I believe is what he ended with last year. You feel really excited about what that could translate to here at Utah, running behind this offensive line, running in this system, this culture that emphasizes the run game. You think he's going to see an increased workload, and as long as he maintains at least similar averages, 1,000 yards seems doable for Wayshawn Parker. What's been interesting is Kerry Rogers, according to Whittingham, who, he's said a lot of different things. He's talked about Wayshawn being emerging as RB1 early on, and now it seems, this is a legitimate 1-2 punch with Kerry Rogers. I do think there is something to it, where, Nakeri coming in, having the offense down, it hasn't been a learning process for him. He knows the offense. That's allowed him to, have a slight advantage, in terms of just running with confidence and running instinctively, where you add that to what the offensive line is probably providing him, compared to what it was at New Mexico. I do think he's somebody that will benefit pretty significantly running behind this offensive line and running for Utah. So I think that's legitimate. I do think Utah has a pretty good 1-2 punch with Wayshawn and with Kerry Rogers. The question here at running back is, who's going to take control of that of that third spot, that RB3 spot. Utah will utilize, some of their Swiss Army knife guys, Nate Johnson and Hunter Andrews. But will it be enough to count on them as designated third running back on the depth chart? Like, I don't know if you can count on them that much. I believe Utah would love for one of the remaining running backs to take hold of that spot, whether it be Duke or Green or Bray or Guillory. I think Utah would love to see one more back sort of separate himself and become that third complement to Wayshawn and Nakari. I think that's going to be the key over the next week or so, is figuring out that final running back spot. I shouldn't say final because I think depth is crucial at running back, where you'll probably get to see RB4 and RB5 at points. I shouldn't say we probably will, but as we've seen in the past, it's very easy to get to that point. And so I think it's going to be really, really valuable for Coach Atuaya to figure out the depth behind those top two guys. I do think it's important to have two good running backs, and the way of one workhorse, I think is sort of a dinosaur in today's game. I think you need multiple backs, and I think Beck understands that, given how he utilized the running back position last year at New Mexico. He had three guys that were really productive, saw a lot of volume, and I think that's going to be important for him to maintain that at Utah this year. So again, I think it's important for Utah to find a third running back, but even then, even beyond that, really solidify that group, as deep as it is, with however many faces, 7 faces. I think it's important to get all 7 of those guys performing at a good level. So, in my opinion, I think Bray obviously would serve as the best complement, the best change of pace to Parker and Rogers, because he has a little bit more speed, a little bit more juice, can do a little bit more in the passing game that you can't do with the other guys. So that's still where I hope to see. That's who I hope to see emerge from this competition. But again, we'll see. Transitioning to the next group is that wide receiver room, and similar story here with the running backs. I think this is a wide open race. Whittingham shared, what was that? When did he share that? Last Monday? No, this Monday. It was this Monday after the scrimmage. Obviously the wide receiver position, it's everybody's favorite position group. I'm pretty sure I've been the guy that's asked for progress updates every single time we've talked to Whittingham. I am the wide receiver guy. I am the designated progress report at wide receiver guy. That's me. That's my role. That's my job. I've signed up for it. I'm about it, because I still think, as much as this offense is going to be about the running game being the engine of the offense, it's nice to have a turbo with the passing game for, some easy points. And I still think, this group, this is an important group. Wide receiver is going to be very important for Utah this year to preserve the space for the running game to hit its maximum potential. Utah needs a viable passing game for the run game to click on all cylinders. So the wide receiver room is a lot of bodies, and Kyle Whittingham made it clear that they've identified the top 7-ish guys who are going to get the bulk of the reps, who they're going to sink the rest of the reps into throughout fall camp. He didn't specify who those 7 were. They're still trying to figure out kind of the bottom of that, the 6, 7, 8 spots, who's going to fit where, and that sort of stuff. But based on what we've learned so far through fall camp, here is my best guess as to not only who the top 7 is, but how that top 7 shakes out. So I think I think the Tobias Merriweather stuff, I think that's legit. I'm going to place him as wide receiver one for Utah. I think it's legit. I think he came into Utah this summer, him and Larry. This is something that Devin Dampier talked about. They spent a lot of time together this summer, spent a lot of hours working out to develop that chemistry. Whittingham talked about it day one that the passing game, you could tell that those guys put in the work to hit the ground running in fall camp. So I was really encouraged by that. Um, I think based on everything else that we've heard, you know, Kyle singled him, Dadrian Zipper, and JJ Buchanan out last week, even though JJ Buchanan is not a receiver, he's a flex tight end. I think Tobias Merriweather is wide receiver one right now on the depth chart. That's my best guess. Number two, I think is actually Creed Whittemore. And, you know, wiggle room here. I think Creed is going to be a slot receiver. But I think he is, in terms of just general pecking order, I would put him number two. I think going back to spring ball, there are a lot of easy ways to get Creed the ball, a lot of easy ways for him to create production. You know, he finished the spring game with, man, 6, 7, 8 receptions and just picked up 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 yards a pop. And I think that's sort of the easy production that he can create and why I put him as sort of the wide receiver two in the hierarchy here. Number three, I've talked about him on Monday's episode, but Larry Simmons. You know, he was a guy I was really interested in because, you know, you can go back a couple years ago. He was a guy that Utah recruited out of high school coming out of Mississippi. He ultimately committed to Ole Miss that year, but he's somebody that I've talked to in the past. And, you know, when he transferred from Ole Miss, I'm not sure what happened, you know, and why he didn't commit to Utah then, but he's here now. And he even talked about it coming out of high school. He wanted to come to Utah, but he was just kind of worried about the homesickness. And so, you know, coming here, I think, based on, you know, what we've learned and what we've heard, you know, Devin Dampier talked about it on Monday that Larry had a big day, you know, at Saturday scrimmage. He had a very productive day and sort of, you know, piecing some of the highlight film, the highlight clips that they posted from Saturday scrimmage, which, by the way, you know, I understand the gripes. We want to see, you know, plays, full sets of plays. We want to see the action. You know, I saw a lot of complaints about the clip that Utah posted, you know, but if you look at other programs and their highlight clips of scrimmages, man, I thought Utah's was action packed with actual football content. You know, I think I watched Tennessee, Florida, Texas Tech, Baylor. I think Baylor, but for sure Tennessee, Florida, and Texas Tech. Their highlight clips of their scrimmages, and man, it was a lot of, you know, players without their helmet on. It was a lot of players talking and going through drills. So, you know, shout out to Utah for giving us even just a little taste, a little glimpse of guys with footballs in their hand and avoiding tackles and that sort of stuff. I just thought that was super funny. So, anyways, back to Larry Simmons. I have him wide receiver 3. Number 4, I have wide receiver 4. I have Ryan Davis. You know, he's the guy. He's sort of an afterthought right now, but I think he has obviously the experience at New Mexico with Dampier, and that chemistry is I think still a thing. I view him as sort of that reliable chain mover, and so you can utilize him in different ways. He played outside at New Mexico. He played in the slot. I think that'll continue to be, you know, his role for Utah, and you know, I think that's going to be a valuable role, right? That was something that was missing. Well, I mean, the passing game in general was missing, but you know, Utah needs just those easy chain movers, and I think Ryan Davis can be that. From here, I think Dadrian Zipper, obviously, you know, getting singled out by Whittingham, that's always kind of telling. I think even, you know, Zipper is probably, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if he's closer to 2 or 3. You know, I think he sort of fits a role similar to Money Parks, Obviously, very similar games, very similar builds and athletic qualities, and I think Zipperer can be that type of receiver for Utah. So I have him fifth, but I think it very easily could be, up to two even in this chart. From here, it gets a little dicey, a little murky, a little less clear, in my opinion. I'm going to put Justin Stevenson as wide receiver 6 and Luca Caldarella as wide receiver 7. So that's how I see the top 7 that Whittingham referred to. And obviously, with this, again, getting back to the initial point, chemistry is going to be key. Dampier, he knows the offense. It's going to be about who is he best synced up with in the passing game that will allow this area, this facet of the game to take off. That's going to be the key, is chemistry moving forward between Dampier and the pass catchers. So, we've gotten encouraging updates along the way that this group, it's making big strides. It's coming along. Again, I've been the guy that's asked for the progress report each and every week. And so it's pretty clear that, Utah, they feel good about their wide receivers. And I think this is a really interesting group. I can't remember who it was that said it. It may have been Tobias. It may have been Larry, but he mentioned something to the effect of, we have a collection of receivers and they all work really well together in terms of their games, their strengths, their weaknesses, their body types and skill sets. They all complement one another. And I think that's super valuable to really maximize this, this passing attack, because Utah, they aren't the type that's bringing in the elite receivers that can do everything. They need those pieces to work well together. And I think they have that with this group. So last group here, last battle here, and I've got to wrap this up because I've gone longer than anticipated. I wanted to be out of here in 30 minutes. The backup quarterback spot, Bird Ficklin and Isaac Wilson. What's it going to be? If last year taught us anything, it's that experience matters, and time in the program, time in the offense matters. And so, as much as last year sucked, for him especially, it was a difficult year, and I think he's said as much, that it was hard, that it was difficult. Isaac Wilson still gained a lot of experience last year. And I've talked about it before. It's all about how he responds to it. And it's all about how he moves forward with that experience under his belt. This is a new offense. It's a different offense. It's not tailored to him, but there's still enough here to work with for him as a quarterback that I think he can find success, that he can make it work. Sure, he's not the athlete that Dampier or Ficklin are, but I think Isaac has enough ability as a passer, and, he's enough of a threat as a runner. Shout out to Oklahoma State, where he can make this work. It's just, what has he learned from last year? Has he put in the work to, in the playbook? Has he put in the time in the playbook and learned all that he's needed to learn? Has he taken the approach of taking it play by play and that sort of stuff, taking what's there? Has he accepted that thought process of taking what the defense has given him? Those are going to be the important questions. And for him, he's got the experience, and that's valuable. Coach Whittingham has talked about it earlier this week, that's kind of a significant factor for him and why he might have the edge here. But for Ficklin, again, great fit in this offense. He's a near clone, perhaps, of Devin Dampier, just a lefty. The way that ball comes off of his hand when he's throwing, man, there is juice there. There is some pop. There is some velocity. He throws a fantastic ball. The athleticism is obvious. He played safety. You can see the athleticism. He can do things that Dampier can do with the run game, and that's great. He's a great fit in this offense. But I think what we learned last year is that, it's a big leap. It's a big adjustment for true freshmen. And regardless of the fit, regardless of how things seem to be going, once you're live, it's a totally different ball game. So for me, I think I would prefer Ficklin to be QB3, to end up QB3, for Isaac to emerge as the backup here, because I think Ficklin has tremendous potential. I want to protect it. I don't want him to experience what Isaac did last year, essentially. So that's my opinion. We'll see. This is, as Whittingham said, still a very tight race. And the nice thing is, it is the backup QB spot. It's everybody's favorite position on the roster. But, it's not imperative that they have this figured out by the end of fall camp. But, it is going to be important for one of them to emerge in this competition as the backup because, Dampier is very healthy. He's been healthy. He was healthy all year last year. Very good at avoiding the big hits, at protecting himself. But again, you just never know. So I think it's going to be really important for one of these guys to emerge. I side with experience and Wilson kind of becoming the backup. So that's what I've got here. Just to wrap up the show, put a bow on this thing, and call it an episode. Just a few other quick takeaways from what we've learned over the last couple of weeks. Some takeaways, some predictions, that sort of stuff. From everything that we've learned, from everything that we've heard from players, from coaches, I do think Utah feels really good about their star players on that defense side of the ball: Smith Snowden, Teo Johnson, Lander Barton. I feel really optimistic that these guys are going to hit their potential and become the type of playmakers that they need for Utah to hit their ceiling on the defense side of the ball. Feel really optimistic that those guys can reach their potential on that side. And then, with Snowden and Barton, continuing to get reps on offense, what sort of impact can they make there? We'll find out this year. But I do think there is a lot there based on, how forthcoming Whittingham has been about it and how he's talked about it, as well as, the players around him. It's I think there's a lot there. So I'm interested to see what that looks like. Bold prediction here. I think Jackson Benny ends up top 7 in snaps played this season on the defensive side of the ball. I think every week somebody has something to say about Benny. He has come out of nowhere as a guy that I think Utah is going to try to figure out how to get him on the field. I think there's a lot of intrigue around Benny and what he's going to do this season. But that's my bold prediction. I think Benny ends up top 7 in snaps played this year for Utah. Moving in back to the defensive trenches, I'm feeling better about the depth at defensive tackle. Obviously, the vets are going to carry this room, but from all accounts, Utah is getting the development that they were hoping for out of their freshman group. Carson Kafusi, Pupu Sepulona, Semi Taulunga, Dylan Battle, Sione Matuapuaka. Those are the guys. They're getting good development out of that group. And, again, Kafusi, Sepulona, those are guys that I think are putting themselves in position to be in the rotation. But I'm feeling better, feeling optimistic. Not significantly better, but we're on an upward trend here with the tackle room. So that's what I'll say there. And then last thing here, Utah's tight end room, not dead, far from it even. It is alive and well. This is a position that everybody had questions about when Beck was hired because Beck didn't use tight ends at New Mexico. But this group, led by Dallin Bentley, I think is still going to be very productive. I think Bentley is going to continue to be that primary tight end, where you then have Hunter Andrews, Otto Tia, and JJ Buchanan as those change-ups, as those flex tight ends to provide different looks and add versatility and creativity to this room. So I still think we'll see a good amount of 12 personnel. Heck, we might even see 13 personnel, just split out wide a little bit more. So Utah's tight end room, alive and well. Man, yeah. Oh, and then last thing. This is the last thing. The offensive line, good at football. Nothing else needs to be said there. So, all right. Appreciate everybody for tuning into this episode. That's all for today's episode. I want to hear from you guys. I always want to hear from you guys. Who do you think is going to emerge as the starters at these spots? Who do you think is going to, how do you think the depth shakes out? Who do you think is going to, emerge in that wide receiver room as the wide receiver one? Who's going to become that go-to wide receiver? I want to hear from you guys. So hit me up, hit up the podcast on the social feeds. Thanks for tuning in. Appreciate it, everybody. For myself, I say this every time, for myself, for the Utah Blockcast, signing off.